Wonderful, great. Please take a seat. So I get to ask some questions, but feel free to ask some questions of me if you like. My opening question is one that relates to all of our individual lives, because you're a doctor, you're a regenerative expert, you're an author, you're a, what would I describe you as, Aubrey? A grandee, a founding father?
I'm described as many things.
So let me ask the question, I'll go left to right. So David, what is the biggest frustration in relation to your work in longevity right now, and how would you go about fixing it?
The greatest.
And shall we start by introducing ourselves quickly, because not everyone in the audience might know who we all are. So
Yeah, let's do that. And actually, I probably ought to just make sure, for those of you who haven't looked at the program, what the main theme of this panel is supposed to be about. It's about communication. I think we called it talking about aging, or something like that, because all of us have, communication as a large part of our jobs in one way or another. So I'm Aubrey. I've been called many things.
I'm Andrew Steele. I wrote a book called Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. And these days, I spend all of my time talking, writing, doing TV stuff about longevity, with the primary aim, actually, which is perhaps slightly unusual, of I really want to increase the funding of the science. That's always the sort of single-minded goal of all the communication I do.
My name is Dr. Jennifer Pearlman. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I'm a practicing physician, about 20 years, working particularly with women, helping them to live longer, healthier, and more beautifully. My practice is focused on a holistic, functional approach to, women-centric approach to health, vitality, and aging, as well as non-surgical aesthetics. So I use terms like regenerative aesthetics to describe that.
My name is David Barzilai. I'm a physician. I have a scientific background. I'm an MD, PhD. Some of you know me as Aging Doc on X, but how I really spend my time is I'm a longevity physician, longevity consultant, and I work with clients closely one-on-one through agingdoc.com. Should I proceed to the question? I was going to say, we're going to go reverse order, right?
Well, let's go for it, and thank you, Andrew, for the correction on that. So David, let's talk about that. So in your work, what is your biggest frustration in relation to the field of longevity, and how would you go about fixing that?
That's a great question. I wish there was just one greatest frustration, but I think it's a sign of the challenges that there is more than one category. At the same time, I've never been more excited to be in this space, wearing hat in the aging biology, geroscience literature, the tremendous progress there, increased public awareness, and amplified funding. It's still not where it should be, but these are great times. In terms of challenges, while the private enterprise is certainly making progress in terms of seeing especially aging biotech investment and organizations. We saw Altos Labs earlier, there's Evolution, the foundation, the Saudi royal decree, dedicating up to $1 billion a year. That's very exciting. It's still not enough. I think we need to have institutional support and a more robust ecosystem. So amongst my concerns, the first is having adequate funding, with the division of aging biology being still only 0.5% of the NIH funding, where chronic disease is 80% of our health expenditures. I think we have a mismatch.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to talk about that later. I think that's a question that we really need to get into about the institutional side of things. Jennifer, how about yourself?
I would say there's a few gaps or layers of frustration. One is a frustration that's evolving into excitement. I mentioned that I focus on women's health, and for about a decade, I helped run the largest menopause clinic in Canada. When I started there, I was in my 20s, having babies, treating women with hot flashes in an era, the dark cloud of the WHI trial, where most doctors, patients, practitioners were scared of hormones. There were really very few options for menopausal women. It's very taboo. They were shunned away from their doctors, which is why they waited about 1.5 years to see me at the hospital. And now, pendulum swung the other way. Menopause is very hot, no pun intended. Hormones are very much in favor. We now recognize estrogen as a longevity hormone for both women and men. And I'm in my 40s, and I'm actually now like the avatar of my practice, because for women particularly, successfully navigating the midlife reproductive aging transition is key to FemSpan, which is what I coined as female longevity. And it's in favor to do it. There are more tools, treatments, and resources than ever before. But still, to another frustration, a significant gap in awareness and focused funding for women's health generally. So when you think about the female longevity factor, my poster outside, women on average are living 7 years longer than men, but spend our last decade with disease, disability, and dementia, accounting for 2/3 of all cases. So FemSpan, this concept is we need female-centric approaches, innovation, funding, and solutions to ensure women are able to realize their biologic aging advantages, longer telomeres, estrogen, mitochondrial, and actually enjoy that female longevity factor. And last, on the communication front, I would just say we still need more language. You know, I'm very active in social media. I speak around the world, and there's a lot of pseudoscience, misinformation, and I would hate for that to create a dark cloud in any way over the excitement of longevity medicine and the hopefully soon arrival of the escape velocity.
Yes, okay, Andrew.
Well, I completely agree with David that funding is the single most important thing. And I think what therefore frustrates me about the sort of wider communication is that when this is talked about in the media, and not only in the media, but by policymakers as well, there's this enormous effect caused by certain prominent, very wealthy individuals who are trying to extend their lifespan by imbibing hundreds of different supplements a day and engaging in, you know, frankly, crazy exercise regimes and, you know, these incredibly strict lifestyles. And that is one thing that's really distorting the discussion here. You know, what we're talking about, by and large, with these longevity medicines is treatments that are going to be available to everybody. And in fact, I think you can make the case that they'll help poorer people who are unable to access, you know, these healthy lifestyles, certainly to the extent that, you know, the incredibly rich do. You can make the argument that these medicines will help those people the most. And yet the way that a lot of people get into this is to read about some billionaire trying to live forever by doing some incredibly complicated stuff, which just sounds completely out of reach, both financially, but frankly, you know, just from a desire point of view, a lot of people don't want to live like that, if that's what living a very long time looks like. And the other thing that I think is really challenging is that a lot of these discussions tend to devolve into purely discussions about lifestyle. This is something that I've really noticed over the last sort of year or two. People often read my book and they then come back to me and say, well, you know, I've read your book and it was really exciting, it's great, I'm going to start brushing my teeth now. And it's like, firstly, I really hope you were brushing your teeth before. Secondly, I'm really glad that, you know, that maybe that's encouraged you to do that a little bit more, and I'm a huge advocate for public health, but I'm really finding a challenge in sort of balancing the huge enthusiasm I have for both public health and for personal lifestyle, nutrition, all these kinds of interventions. I will nerd out about zone 2 and how much protein you should consume all day, but the single most important thing that's going to move the needle in terms of healthy lifespan is increasing the funding for the science and making sure that we develop real anti-aging medicine. And so if we spend our entire lives, you know, obsessing over what are frankly often quite a contradictory batch of studies about exactly what the lifestyle intervention should be, by the time you're getting, you know, 30 minutes of exercise a day and eating broadly the right stuff, the single thing that's going to make the biggest difference to your lifespan and the lifespan of everybody that you care about is developing these medicines. And so I think we really need to somehow, while not dismissing public health and looking like a bunch of tech bros, we have to really refocus the conversation on trying to create these medicines and making them accessible to everybody.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've obviously got to get the science down. The science is expensive. It's necessary to change the stance, the minds of people who are in a position to write checks, especially the people who are in a position to write large checks. And I guess the fundamental frustration that I have in that is that most of the people who are doing the communication about this whole field and about longevity in general are doing it for money. In other words, they are media organizations whose job it is to sell papers and, just generally, make money out of the communication process. And that means pandering to the prejudices that their intended audience already has. So, for at least a decade or more after I started becoming reasonably high profile 20-odd years ago, the overwhelming majority of the coverage on my work that came out in the mainstream media was, if not exactly ridiculing me, at least it was written for the purpose of entertainment rather than education, put it like that. And that has changed somewhat, but it hasn't changed nearly enough. And of course, the reason here is what I've always called the pro-aging trance, the desperation that the general public has for putting aging out of their minds and not getting their hopes up before, in order that because they don't know how long it's going to take before we bring aging under comprehensive medical control. So those of us who are not communicating for the purpose of making money are in the minority, and we're in a difficult position trying to kind of sidestep and marginalize the people who are. And I haven't really got a good solution to that. It definitely is my main frustration.
So, I mean, when you think about what the industry feels like now, I would say that there are schools of thought, or maybe even camps that exist now. So you mentioned Brian Johnson, obviously. So there are certain people
Not by name, but yes.
that will pursue the route that he does, right? So they're very committed to what they want to do, and they'll follow his regime. There are other people that will be much more serious and much more grounded in the way that they do it. And when you talk about things like immortality and so on in conversations, in conferences such as this and others, then other people shut down. You have other issues where you've now got the clinical community, which is getting much more deeply involved in this. My GP is fascinated by the things that I do, but doesn't understand really half of it. Do you feel that there is a correction now that we are more than just one industry effectively sitting under this banner of longevity? And how do we start to either identify who's in the tent or outside the tent, and make sure it's still inclusive, of course, but really, if we're going to progress forward, we need to start talking with a much more cohesive vocabulary, I would suggest. So I'd be interested in all of your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. Well, first, to expound on your point, I couldn't agree more with Aubrey's last point in terms of the public conception to make it on the communication piece. There are many people walking around who feel it's utterly hopeless, we all get old and die, and that anybody who's talking about living older, they're selling snake oil. And I think they have a justifiable reason to assume that. I think we could be doing a better job communicating, but we're against a headwind of a very long tradition of snake oil salesmen, where before this aging biology was really developed, you talk to people, most of them are utterly clueless that you can double C. elegans from a single gene mutation. So it's no longer concept, there are thousands of genes, you'll have to do all this tinkering. So it is modifiable, and for people to understand that.
Do you think that people get that now? I mean, do you not think that people
I think it's starting to change, and I'll play a little devil's advocate, actually expounding on your point, Phil, is I believe that we are strongest as a community when we have multiple different ideas represented in multiple approaches. There are going to be individuals who pursue the field very much focused on lifestyle medicine, exercise, diet, nutrition, and truth be told, this is the most effective thing we have today. How far can it take us? Well, even if we cured cancer, there's work by J. Olshansky that it would only extend the average lifespan by maybe 3-4 years, something like that. So there's much more potential for things that have yet to be implemented in people. And that's what I think programs like the LEV Foundation, what Andrew was speaking to, that's what it's all about, making the investments now, looking ahead, because we only will get so far. But playing devil's advocate, I don't think it's one or another approach. I think they're both underfunded. Public health, in the broadest, preventative medicine, basic things we all could be doing. And the other thing, geroscience, which is vastly underinvested, and not just uninvested, but our very regulatory system is set up where it's very challenging. And I think the onus on us is also to work with the NIH for that. The only other point to make there, a second devil's advocate, and then I'll move it on to my esteemed colleagues, is it's true that there are different different communication styles. I think what they all should have in common is a sense of perspective and honesty, transparency, clarity. So there'll be some individuals who are very into biohacking, cutting-edge interventions that may or may not prove out to human beings, but we don't know that yet. Every day we're living older, and every day where we don't intervene, there's an opportunity cost then. So I think it's not unreasonable to pursue now emergent therapies as long as it's educated, balanced information, where there's transparency and where you're making a guided assessment, where take risks every day for possible gain.
Yeah, I guess to not go around each question four times. I mean, the snake oil is less of a term than I hear now. People are starting to get it. People understand that there's plasticity associated with aging. We're starting to see evidence of it going through the system now. But of course, we've got a lot of people to convince, whether it's finance organizations, regulators, or whatever it may be. So just interested in your thoughts now about where we go as an industry. How do we take what we've done, what we've achieved so far, and move this forward to the point where we can start to get those therapeutics going through the pipeline?
Well, let me first of all address the question of cohesiveness a little bit, because I think there's an important point or two to be made here. In the science, of course, it's very important for all of us to plow a diverse range of furrows in order to make progress as quickly as possible. And that happens best when there is something of a spectrum of opinion. Like a good example would be this debate I did with Peter Fedichev recently, which was very well received by the community. And I must say, Peter and I enjoyed it very greatly as well. But that's because we're both very much on the same side in terms of the overall goals. It's just, we wanted to explore some fairly nuanced differences of opinion on the science. The key thing is that the overall message that this is actually a rather important thing to be working on, and we have a respectable chance of making a respectable amount of progress in the foreseeable future. That's something that we all need to be saying with one voice as loudly as possible. And of course, that was the basis for the Dublin Longevity Declaration that came out a year ago at this conference, and that I definitely feel we need to continue to promote. But the final thing I want to say about this cohesion and so on is one enormous amount of progress that we think we have made is the fact that there are now enough people in this community doing the communication that we can actually have a panel like this up here. For years and years, I was bemoaning the fact that I was pretty much the only person out there talking the good talk, so to speak. And, I feel I'm pretty good at what I do, but I'm only good at what I do. There are communities that I resonate well with the way I say things, and there are communities where I don't. And so when that started to change with Liz Parrish coming along and starting to, say more or less the same stuff in a very different way, and Keith Comito doing the same thing with his experience at Disney and so on, and now people like Andrew and David and Jennifer, we are in a very different position. I think we need to be leveraging that diversity of style as much as we possibly can.
Andrew, you're spending a lot of time dealing with communicating the benefit of all of this to people. Do you have the ear of government? Are there policymakers reading your book, for example?
I hope so. I think that the real challenge we've got with policymakers is that they just don't know this is a thing. I think it's very hard for us in this room to remember that actually the idea that you can slow down aging or it's malleable. I know you said that you think people are getting it, and I think they are. Progress is in the right direction, but it's very, very slow. Mm-hmm. And if you think about Joe Biden launched a cancer moonshot a few years ago. I think a lot of politicians, they know friends and relatives who've died of diseases, but what they don't know is the science that says that aging was the thing that caused those diseases by and large. And that's a strange connection for a lot of people to make, I think. A lot of people see aging as just a sort of natural process of getting wrinkly and grey and maybe a bit slower and more frail. but they don't make the biological connection with those disease endpoints. And it's very easy to go into a room and say, we should cure cancer. And obviously scientists will quibble with that word cure, and cancer's many different diseases. But if you go into a room and say even something more moderate, like maybe we should try and slow down the aging process, then suddenly you get this huge spectrum of moral questions that come up. And people just think it sounds completely implausible, even though we know that if you were to go into a room and say, by diet and exercise and lifestyle and public health interventions, we can make people age better, that's very accepted, and that's sort of proof of principle that we can slow the aging process. It's surprisingly difficult to communicate that maybe biomedicine should be an intervention. And one example I think that really shows that this isn't getting through to policymakers is that you hear a lot of debate at the moment about maybe population decline or low birth rates or low fertility, and the sort of aging population narrative in general is that we've got fewer young people who are growing up and a larger and larger population of older people by comparison. And when you hear those debates in the media with policymakers, it's all about how can we get women to have more children. And that's an important policy question, of course. What can we do to incentivize that? But I've never heard a single person in a debate like that say, oh, why don't we invest more in longevity science, which then means people will stay healthier for longer, and that's going to alleviate many of the problems that this aging society is going to cause. And I think until we get to the point where it's being reached for as a policy solution in that sort of setting, we haven't won this battle. And that's what I would like to try and, what I'd like to see being done. And I think the way that we do that, actually my sort of next project is to try and set up some kind of think tank or policy institute. So if there are any philanthropists in the audience, please do get in touch after the talk. Because I think although there have been a lot of people, Aubrey's obviously been doing this for very many years, I don't think as a community we've successfully presented this in the way that politicians normally understand. So they want to see a white paper exploring the sort of demography impacts, what's going to be the meaning for pensions, what's this going to mean for our healthcare system, what is the economic impact? If we want to look back at the literature of that, there was a paper that came out in 2021 that estimated an economic benefit of slowing down aging. There was another paper called the Longevity Dividend in 2007. And if you read those papers, you've basically read the entire literature in the last 30 years, which is remarkable. And it makes it very hard for me to then go to politicians and make that case. So I think we really do need to just start sort of more conventional lobbying efforts that a lot of other industries do very successfully. I think we're now at a point where we've got enough proofs of principle that that's something we should be starting to do in earnest.
Yeah. And Jennifer, you're also...
I can add two quick things to what David and Andrew shared. Speaking to patients every day and in a very regulated environment like we have in Canada where healthcare is largely free, in other words, insured, I do go through great lengths to explain, to your point, this concept of this is uninsured because it is investigational, perceived as complementary or alternative by our regulators, but actually is the frontier, and I explained that there is evidence, but it's not yet considered core to the medical curriculum. And so I have so much language. When I say so much language, consent forms, disclosures, communication at social events, where I translate that into a quick synopsis of why it is uninsured. And I think that, just like patients are used to paying for organic food, their gym membership, or cosmetic treatments like Botox, this extra investment in themselves, which can still be done in an accessible way. So it is not necessarily only for the very well-resourced, is something that I think at large the public is comfortable with. And to your, this idea around policymakers and big decisions in the space and funding, it's interesting in solving the aging crisis of our population. It's interesting the mixed sentiments around the concept of mitigating or doing away with menopause, right? Prolonging forever the reproductive lifespan of women. And I have mixed feelings on that, spending my entire career focused on, that transition and what happens. Women have two phases of their lives, right? Our lives, reproductive and aging, marked at the midlife by the menopause. And we are the first generation of women that will outlive our reproductive life by more than a factor of 1. It's very interesting to think what would happen if we did away with it entirely, and how should we communicate with policymakers, and what should be the targets of investment and innovation.
And what about the clinical community? You're both representing the clinical community, which is really they're embracing this. People are getting into it now. They understand the vocabulary to a degree. There are conferences for it happening now around the world. But they're the main interface between the work that goes on amongst us now and the general public. So how do you feel we should be bringing in the clinical community into this wonderful industry?
I think there's more than one level. Like we were discussing earlier, the innovation. I think innovation starts, a lot of it, with at higher price because it's really leading edge. That's kind of the way of flat screen TVs, the way of other technologies. So I think part of it is kind of acknowledging these early adaptation. But regarding I want to make sure regarding the clinical community itself, there are two layers. One, there's a public health and primary care layer. And I think we need to be educating more physicians as well as policy makers about the potential of aging biology and things they can be doing now. For example, one paradigm for longevity medicine that is accessible even to general practitioners is this basic concept of measuring an earlier biomarker that might capture a sufficient amount of biologic aging to be able to measure it before and after an intervention. I think these are early days for that. These are early days for things like methylation clocks, but it's not too early with the caveats and understanding as if its limitations and integrating with other functional traditional laboratory biomarkers to have these feedback loops of measuring, intervening, and repeating. So that's at one stage. The other stage, I think, is at the level of people who currently call themselves longevity physicians or functional medicine providers. There's a very broad term, longevity medicine, and I think it's being used very differently between different clinicians. So even among the more educated longevity medicine community, it's all over the map what is actually being done. So I think an important form of advancement is not only educating those in primary care docs to equip them with these preventative early marker tools, but it's also achieving more consensus as a evidence-based longevity community. Like, what is that? To me, that's precision medicine. It's personalized to the individual. It is a evidence-based medicine. It's data-driven, but it's more evidence-based. It's not all clinical guidelines. It's reasonable to discuss these early interventions. Mm-hmm. To me, that is the cutting edge in a precision medicine venue, but we need to be meeting, and something I have to pay applause to. Now we have a Healthy Longevity Medicine Society, spearheaded by Andrea Meyer and others, to try to create these kind of consensus statements on what it is and what it looks like. And we're also upping the scale for education that's accessible to everyone, including clinicians, like the newly created Geneva College of Longevity Sciences.
Yeah.
So education and tools.
Okay, well, I mean...
I can share very quickly from a clinical perspective. You know, when I started a long time ago, and the language, I completely agree with you. You know, we weren't using words like longevity and regenerative medicine 20 years ago, but if you mentioned bioidentical hormones or the microbiome or gut permeability, you know, you'd be really poo-pooed by my conventional colleagues. And I work in, you know, I wear a lot of different academic and clinical and community hats when I'm communicating and seeing patients. And it's changed so much. I can tell you, I have a lot of doctors as patients, primary care specialists, and other healthcare providers. And I think that also says a lot because they should be the early adopters. But there is an old guard, and the old guard, and I mean this figuratively, but maybe a little bit literally, is dying off. And I do think that with new science and new blood in many of these academic strongholds, you know, like the Menopause Society and other, you know, the cardiology world, where recognizing a lot of things that we would talk about in precision, personalized, N of one, regenerative medicine, lifestyle-based medicine is very much coming to the front, and recognizing old world RCTs won't work the same way for N of 1 precision medicine. We have to be open and have new investigative tools, educational tools, and communication tools.
So let's just finish off. We're over time, I'm afraid, but I'd love to ask a question to you all about where we are with the GLP-1s. Because what's happening in the space, of course, is very interesting with their progression against the aging diseases, the share prices, the grey market. Do we see in what's happening with the GLP-1s, what's going to happen with longevity therapeutics in the future? Do we start to see the craze and the upside of all of that? Just interested in your thoughts on that.
So I think the GLP-1 agonists are a huge opportunity for us to do one thing that actually perhaps ought to have been my answer to your first question about frustrations. In the wider world, the fundamental problem that we have in selling what we do is that our goal is preventative. It's to stop people from getting sick rather than to stop people from being sick. And preventative medicine has always been an insanely hard sell. It's okay if something's preventative, but everyone believes in the cliche that prevention is better than cure. So it's fine if something's preventative and there's no reason not to do it. So exercise, but apart from that, when it comes to medicine, we've got almost no examples of successful medicines that are preventative. We've basically got statins for high cholesterol, and we've got ACE inhibitors for high blood pressure. And now we have the GLP-1 agonists, for being overweight, which is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, right? So this is fantastic. But if we look at these things, they've all got in their edgeways. They started out being, certainly the statins started out being treatments, and they just kind of gradually became used more and more preventatively. So it hasn't really changed the psychology of being inherently suspicious of preventative medicine. Maybe now that we have another opportunity with the GLP-1 agonists having come along, we can somehow say, listen, you get it now. Preventative medicine is a good thing, and that may make our job a lot easier when it comes to preventative medicine for aging in general.
I think there are two good things about this. The first of which is it's just a proof of concept that people do take these things. Because you might think, people are very suspicious of medication, and there are various barriers in the way of people taking preventative drugs. But actually, people are really excited to get their hands on this stuff. And as you say, there's black and grey markets, and Novo Nordisk can't supply the drugs at the level at which they're being demanded. So that's a cool thing. That shows that people, although they say they're a bit cagey about taking a preventative medicine, actually, even though we should probably be, maybe even in some cases, being a little bit more cautious about these things, because we don't have very long-term data on them. They have been being used for a decade or two, but remember, when we're talking about aging, we're looking at multiple decades of life. But it does show that people have this enthusiasm. And the audience that I found this goes down the best with, actually, is investors. Because I think that in the general public, there was a huge amount of press about GLP-1s about a year ago. And there was no end of articles about journalists taking them and all these different things, and this huge debate about whether we were medicalizing something that was just part of everyday life. And actually, I think the good thing is that in practice, if you look at what people do rather than what they say, they're very happy to take the drugs and be better and have this prevention happen, thanks, which is another great thing for aging. But because Novo Nordisk's stock price is still riding so high, I think investors haven't ceased to pay attention. And this is just proof that if you come up with a drug where the total addressable market, a bit of investor jargon I learned at a recent investment banking conference, is so huge, because obviously people who are overweight is a significant fraction of populations in most rich countries. People who are aging is an even bigger fraction of those populations. And so what that means is, I think investors are sitting up and taking notice. And so hopefully this is a good news story that we can use as an example of, just the sort of scale of what we can try and achieve here.
Yeah.
The man that is credited with discovering GLP-1 was my mentor, endocrinologist and entrepreneur Dan Drucker from Toronto. We're also home of insulin. I actually think GLP-1 should be considered a gateway drug. It's not the first, but it's by far $1 trillion peptide incretin hormone. So it's really opening up this gateway to a new therapeutic channel of peptide hormones, peptides. And there's different types of peptides, and they're important endogenous signals, and harnessing their ability through therapeutics. There's the GLP-1s, there's dual agonists and triagonists on their way with GIP and glucagon as two other peptides being used for complementary effects. I actually think we will see that they have pleiotropic effects that are so important beyond insulin sensitizing and metabolic revitalizing, the gut-brain axis, inflammation. I use them quite a bit in my practice, and a lot of patients come back with side benefits that are so significant around inflammation. I mean, there's studies now, cardio-renal, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, fertility, particularly for patients with PCO. So I think it's early days in the category, and that's why I think of it really as like a gateway to a lot of health benefit that is unknown and potential risk. But in my practice, it's used in concert with intensive holistic approach, and very much for anyone using it who's aging, and especially for women in the perimenopause and beyond, it's got to be combined with a high protein, a muscle-centric approach, high protein, weight bearing, because so far these drugs, the muscle and bone comes along with the fat.
It's even created its own aftermarket, hasn't it, really, in terms of muscle? Dave?
I love your ending question, Phil. And by the way, fabulous. It was fabulous being here, your moderation. As a longevity physician and MD, PhD physician scientist who does longevity consulting focusing on evidence, if I have one takeaway for this audience, it dovetails beautifully with your last question to us. It's not an or proposition, it's both. Is it about life extension or is it about being healthy? It's not either or, it's about both. So that's the argument for investing in aging biology. And it's the same thing with the GLP-1 agonist. What is it? Is it going to be prevention, or is there going to be funding things that we all can benefit from, including those of us who are already optimized for lifestyle? So I believe that taking the best of both worlds, GLP-1 agonists let us, in a selective way, find individuals who would benefit having that in addition to. It's not going to be everyone, but that's the beauty of longevity medicine. It's in a precise way for everyone. So let's embrace both.
Wonderful. Well, David, Jennifer, Andrew, Aubrey, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry we overran everybody, but please join me in thanking our panel today.
Thank you very much.